Hi everybody, welcome back to the Columbus School of Chinese here in Columbus, Ohio. We've had a lot of good discussion this week at the school about radicals. So today I want to talk a little bit more about radicals, what use they have to you as a student, what use they don't have to you as a student, what we want to avoid any confusion with them, and give you a little bit of background and facts about what radicals really are. First, as I mentioned last time, radicals are these graphical components that make up Chinese characters. You can have a radical as a character just by itself with nothing in addition to it, or you can have a radical with other components put together to form a more complex character. These radicals are kind of a new idea. They started as a concept in the 1600s, and then in the 1700s we kind of had our set number of radicals at 214. These are sometimes called the Kangxi radicals because this was the reign of the Kangxi emperor during this time when scholars set this exact number, 214. And there's a ton of resources online. You can look at the Kangxi radicals, how many there are, number of strokes, what they mean by themselves, how frequently they show up, etc., etc. And a lot of it's pretty interesting. However, not all of it is very useful if what your goal is just purely literacy. If you're interested in the history and evolution of Chinese script, there's a lot of really good stuff in here. But you can kind of get, bogged down in the weeds, so to speak, as a beginner learner, trying to put all this extra information about the history of Chinese characters in your head as you're just getting started. So we kind of want to make this as a word of warning to new students. Don't let this scare you or bog you down. Pay attention to what's useful to you and leave the other stuff for later. Okay, so we know that radicals are the graphical components, and sometimes there could be multiple ones. Well, which one is the radical? Are there multiple radicals in the same character? Well, no. So when the scholars were setting up this system, every character would have one component that would be considered the radical. This is how they set up their original dictionary. So you'd have a radical. The word radical in Chinese, we call it a 部首. 部首 means the head of a list. What lists were they? Well, for example, we have our tree radical that we talked about last time. That would be the head of our list in the dictionary. Then underneath that would be listed every single character that had the tree radical as its radical. So there's only one part of a character that is set up as the radical. Sometimes this is very obvious which part is the radical. Sometimes it's not. And before the advent of electronic dictionaries, when you're trying to look up a new word you don't know how to pronounce yet, it was sometimes a little bit of trial and error to figure out which part of the character is the radical and which part isn't. You might have to choose a couple different graphical components to try to find where this character was. All right, so let's take an example so you can see what I mean. We have the character an meaning peaceful or quiet. An, if you have a little bit of knowledge about characters already, you know that we have two different graphical components here. We have the roof graphical component. This can be a radical at times. And we have the bottom part, which is the female radical. Now, which one out of these two happens to be the designated radical for the character? Well, you might have to figure it out by trial and error if you don't know. It happens to be the roof radical. Why is that the radical and not the female radical for this character? It was arbitrarily chosen by these scholars in the 1700s that that's how it was. Okay, so let's take one more example, and I'm purposely trying to confuse you here, so don't worry. We have the character mian. Mian means one's face. It could be like a person's face or the face of a mountain. What's the radical here? Where's the radical? It's a pretty complicated character. There's a lot of strokes going on. It turns out that this whole thing is a set radical that should not be considered to have different parts. It is all one complicated radical. It would not be separated. Now you might be saying to yourself, wait a minute, I know that a single line across, a single horizontal line can be a radical. That the first stroke is one of those. Why isn't that the radical? Well, it was arbitrarily set up this way. All right, so hopefully that clears up a couple more questions about radicals. They actually are really interesting. My job as a teacher is to tell you what's important about them and what's not. So hopefully this video kind of gives you a little bit of guidance on what radicals are and what you can take for them going forward as you get more and more familiar with Chinese.